Hello, YouTube community. Welcome back to my page, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Thank you for joining us. I was very stoked and excited to really talking about, the different paths up the mountain of consciousness and to make a video about the different transformative experiences to really kind of spell them out, what they are, and how, in my viewpoint, they're all interconnected and to me one and the same. And by that, I will be talking about near-death experiences, abbreviated as NDEs, spiritually transformative experiences, or SDEs, shared death experiences, SDEs, and out-of-body experiences as OBEs, and more. So you might ask, what prompted myself to make this video? Well, I've been giving talks and NDEs for, almost a decade now, and my own NDE rather, and NDEs in general, as a psychotherapist. And so I kind of view these things from both angles, as an experiencer, but also a therapist who has counseled, many different clients in many different groups and settings, about spiritual phenomenon. But I found that a lot of people felt left out if they didn't have one of these things, and they would view in not necessarily jealousy, but they would view like, oh my God, it's so easy for you to talk about this stuff and to have this mindset. When you've had that, you're privileged, and I didn't have this experience, or I don't. So I wanted to make these kind of videos to kind of clear the air, how each and every one of us are transformative beings, had memories just beyond this lifetime, but also, that we don't have to have these experiences per se to know them, to remember them. I find that gets people in trouble, in the spiritual community at times, is that many times we'll gravitate to our familiars. And I use this as a therapist. So we know it's good for our change, but many times we'll stick with that same partner, that same job, even though it's no good for us, but we're used to it. So our comfort zones in life is often what we pivot to. And what oftentimes brings people to, these conversations or these topics is, maybe the life that they were brought up into, with religion or their own belief system was good, or maybe it was not good. Maybe it was damaging, and they were yearning, or their soul was yearning for more that they couldn't, that they weren't nourished by within their own upbringing, their own, religious belief system. That's what often brings people, to this stuff, among other things. But, religion is very unidimensional. It's kind of like, this is the way, you have to follow these things, and there is no other way many times. And so that's often displaced in spirituality, where I have to have things a certain way, or it has to be all these steps and all these criteria. Otherwise, it's not real, it's not authentic. And I say, religion will tell you that awareness, or just kind of like higher awareness, it's outside of ourselves. It's in the hands of someone else or some belief system outside of ourselves. And what I've learned through my own direct near-death experience, what separates religion and spirituality is religion is an external belief system of God, or external God, external awareness that we live our lives from, and spirituality is an inner awareness that is within each and every one of us. It's something that we're born with, and we are aware before we come into this lifetime. And it is in the own backyard of ourselves, and we don't have to travel thousands of miles away to have this awareness. We can meditate in the Himalayas, but that's not necessary. The doorway to awareness is right within ourselves. And experiencing my own NDE at just 3 years old, I recognized that I didn't have to grind to get this degree of awareness in this lifetime, that at just 3 years old, that awareness was within me. It's within all of us, is what I'm trying to say. And that's not saying that we become, but it's something that we already are, that we remove a lot of the pieces that we're holding on to of our identity, or the identity of life, to become it. And sometimes in order to find truth, we have to lose who we are, or lose what we're looking at, in order to really regain awareness. We have to shed our own shells of identity, so to speak, or shed a little bit of the ego, that construct that we develop through life, that's the human construct of how we see ourselves, largely based off of the world experiences and how others see us, but that is a very limited version of who we are, as we are unlimited beings, and oftentimes in the ego, we see ourselves as a limited version of who we are. But what I wanted to really talk about is NDEs and SDEs, OBs, and more. Let's start with NDEs. NDEs, the the phenomenon has been going on for thousands of years. You could find it in, Jesus's texts, talking about NDEs, as well as, Plato, talked about NDEs. Um, so they're getting a lot of traction now, I feel, as there's many factors, with near-death experiences. I think the advancements of science and medicine has, enhanced the incubation of life and death. I think the internet, where there's a lot more access to information, has more widespread. And, I credit a lot of people like Dr. Imamudi, who coined the term near-death experience, who's a clinical psychiatrist and also has his PhD in philosophy. And, I think the 70s, he coined the term near-death experience, which he probably had a different term that he wanted to, but that was kind of a more academic kind of term. But for him, the term was something that would kind of stick with others. But, near-death experience has to do when people either face or flatlined in their death. So there's no degree of life that they have, or they have very close encounters to death, and their consciousness, their awareness goes beyond this body. And so it's that conundrum of this body and this awareness, or the brain and the mind. And so, at least for myself, what I could say is when my body and my brain were completely limited to, non-existent, I had the most awareness I'd ever had in my whole life. And so if the body and the brain produces consciousness, how is that possible? And there's many mind-blowing encounters of near-death experiences of people who were, flatlined, and they're able to remember the conversations of the doctors in the hospital, or they, this is before, I forget the term, but before they're able to have drones and stuff like that, they could go teleport their awareness, to the top of the hospital and the roof and see what's on there and come back with clarity. So the degree of evidence, that people have, they wouldn't be able to do this even if they were fully conscious in their bodies, and they have even more awareness beyond this body. And to this day, the material reductionist and, people who view that once we reduce our brains and our body, there's nothing left, are still put into a corner. They still don't know why this phenomenon occurs or why there's awareness. But NDEs really separate brain and the mind as two really separate entities. But essentially people with NDEs could have distressing NDEs. Many different researchers will talk about people who have NDEs and they have distressing ones. But I want to preface that from my own experience and from my own degree of studying, that once you go into the light, you don't have distress. There's complete euphoria when you go into the light. I think there can be distress, certainly that I had, where you could be trauma, or you could have trauma in terms of, your body going and suffocating and the death of the body process. But once your soul is reawakened, when you cross over, there is no real stress. So I have a feeling that distressing NDEs, many times they don't fully cross over, but they have a close to death experience, and they have, some degrees of memories from that. But then within NDEs, there could also be the euphoric experiences where people, have these supernatural experiences where they cross over, like I did, like people like Anita Morjani, Dr. Eben Alexander, Dr. Mary Neal, who we're familiar with, who have these incredibly beautiful encounters with heaven, and they cross over to their side. They see their loved ones, angels, God, you name it. And they have these profound, degrees of experiences. But oftentimes is what happens with these NDEers, that they come back totally transformed. And there's people who have been even atheists with near-death experiences, who didn't believe in a God at all, and they've come back totally awakened. I could think of one of them in near-death experience who had this. Her name is Nancy Rhines, who was an atheist and had her NDE, and totally now is transformed. So what often comes is transformation, as well as after effect gifts that people often have. Many psychics and many mediums have had near-death experiences that you see in the public. I mean, one that I could think of is a good friend and colleague of mine who had his NDE as an infant or a child. His name is Mark Anthony, otherwise known as the psychic lawyer. So these shake-up periods, in one's life, I think really shake up people's awareness and their, psychic gifts and their just connection to the spirit realm. And certainly that happened to me, which we'll get into some later videos. But I have a feeling that a lot of the shakeup has to do with the brain, as the brain, I learned, was just the filter of life. And once you go through near-death experiences, oftentimes there's a lot of shifts within the brain. There's a lot of deprivation of oxygen that could occur in the brain. And all of a sudden in your brain, you're able to really tap into a mind beyond this brain and get in touch with that. And so I think the brain structure really changes for a lot of near-death experiencers. And they're just familiarity with the other side and their recollection of it. So let's talk a little bit more about NDEs and other videos, but more and more people are having them, and they improve when there's support around them. I mean, there's people around them that are able to support their experiences and not disvalidate their experiences. But each and every day we're getting more and more encounters, and there's around almost 10% of the population now, I believe, last I checked, that has had these phenomena. So it's a growing degree of the population. The next is out-of-body experiences, something that I've had. In a sense that this could be, at least for me, where I was just kind of going through my daily experiences, and all of a sudden for several weeks, I was just literally outside of my body. And it was incredibly profound that, in a sense, my consciousness and how I was able to really see myself went beyond just my body. And so this wasn't just during when I was sleeping, but walking day in and day out, fully awaked. I was aware of myself, but I was experiencing life outside of my body. And this is different than, many people who experience trauma. I know trauma, there's a lot of, disassociation, and people protect themselves oftentimes by having kind of like an out-of-body experience, which is kind of like temporary. But, these OBEs to me are more so, not necessarily distressful, but they're more so, pleasant and euphoric and beautiful. And they're usually not predated by a distressing event. They just kind of happen. But sometimes it could, it depends. And they just remind us that our consciousness and who we are is not produced by the body, but goes beyond the body. And at least to me, it reminded myself of how much energy and light and wisdom was inside of me that I just kind of forgot. And this happened to me, in my adult years. And I talk a little bit more in Life After Breath about this, and I'm sure in other subsequent videos I'll get into it, more focused. But that's an out-of-body experience. Shared death experience, or an SDE, is incredible, profound. I know, my colleague, and she wrote the foreword of Life After Breath. Her name is Dr. Sharon Prentice. She had incredible, profound, SDE, in which it was really accelerated by grief, in which she crossed over, and she was able to really join the passing of her loved ones, and crossed over to the other side and joined her loved ones. If you ask Dr. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience, he'll tell you that they're incredible, but SDEs have him even more perplexed in a way, because there's nothing that happens to the body with an SDE, the shared death experience. The body's totally fine, and yet people with SDEs are able to just leave their bodies and cross over to the other side and join their loved ones in their, experiences. Many times they don't fully cross over to their loved ones. They might be with their loved ones before they cross over, and their loved ones will say, I'll kind of take it from here, but I'm always with you. But, SDs are not just with human connections. They're oftentimes, with their pets. I know my brother, to a degree, had an SDE when my dog passed away, where there's many different levels of SDEs, but he just remember when my dog passed away, how there was just this euphoric peace in the room. And many times it's not associated with death, but he just kind of felt this euphoric peace. Or many times people will sense kind of flowers or feel their dogs just crossing over and being there with them, or their cats or their birds or their ferrets, whatever that is. So, SDs is really when our loved one crosses over and we kind of join them in that crossing over experience. And so I really recommend, looking at SDEs, because I think a lot more of you listeners probably had them to a degree and didn't really recognize it. So look into that a little bit more, as well as my friend Dr. Sharon Prentice. She has a terrific book called Becoming Starlights. So I'd recommend her book as well as, the SDE information. The next one is spiritually transformative experience, which to me, at least to me, all right, I'm not a researcher, but I'll label this, I'll identify this as it could be any experiences in our life which changes our consciousness. So we're looking at life through a certain degree of reality, and all of a sudden that is just blown off the roofs, and we look at things in a different way, or it could just be shifted in a different way, where something happens in our life, and it could totally change. I know, for instance, grief is a very common factor that causes a degree of a spiritual transformative experience, where many times people who are going through grief, who may not have any degree of belief systems, all of a sudden just have these experiences in life, and they could feel their loved ones, or they see their signs from loved ones, and it transforms maybe someone who is ambivalent or someone who is a total skeptic or non-believer of this stuff to be a believer. And so I think we are all transformative experiences. Each and every day, we're changing. Our biology is changing each and every day. But our consciousness and how we view reality has the ability to change when we're able to challenge our worldviews or get uncomfortable. Several centuries ago, they looked at the world as flat, and that was what they knew many times. And they're still flat earthers, and I'm not talking about those people, but many times they just looked at the world through this lens. And it was through the power of curiosity, the power of exploration, to challenge what they knew, to go into the unknown. And when they were able to go into the unknown, their known, or what they knew, became expanded. And so I think for people to transform, it requires a degree of vulnerability. It requires a degree of expanding what we know, to say that we don't know, and to be open to infinite possibilities. And I could tell you, to this day, I've had near-death experience, but it didn't tell me that I knew everything or that I had everything in those moments, but it put me in the quest of curiosity for each and every day to know more and more. To me, death is the significance of an ending. And I view, when we're alive, we want to live. But many people, when they're alive, they're not fully alive, but it's almost like a death, because they're looking at life through a certain way, and it's kind of stopped. There's no openness for change. It's kind of like a stale body of water in a state park that has no flow, and it's just kind of stinky. You don't want to be around those kind of people. You want to be around people who are able to rejuvenate their energy, change their energy, shift their energy, and always reinventing, reinvigorating the flow of life, to look at life in a new way. So be vulnerable. I think that allows people to change. So my point of this video is that we have a lot of these different experiences chopped up, but my theory is that they're all one and the same. They're all one and the same. And my also theory is that you don't need to have these experiences to know what they are. I say this because in many of my videos, people will listen to my talks, my workshops, my videos, and I'll say to them, you're here right here today because what I'm saying to you is familiar. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here today, if what I was saying isn't familiar. And how people relate to that familiarity is different. Some may push it away to make them, to protect themselves and say, what is this nonsense? What is this schmuck talking about? And that's how people will often, relate to things that are different. We do that with a lot of different areas in life. We'd rather know what we know. When how we relate to the unknown, that depends on each person. But the growth-oriented mindset, people will continuously explore the unknown, to make it more known, and find different ways to engage with it. And so I think all these experiences are many paths up to the mountain, but they're the similar result of seeing life in a different way. And so, as my greatest spiritual teacher of all time would say, Dr. Wayne Dyer would say, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And so a lot of this stuff hopefully will allow all of us to take the glasses that we're looking at life and find just a different way of seeing life. As I find, perception is our reality. And so, all these things to me are one and the same, is that we're living life through a certain degree of seeing things, and these kind of periods are just kind of like shake-up periods where they just shake the ground and the foundation. They could rock our worlds over reality, and they allow us to see things in a different way. So it's my hope, that this made sense to some of you who have had these experiences, or maybe some of you who did not. And I want to tell you that you aren't left out. And I also want to preface that you don't need to have these experiences to have them, that even having a near-death experience is not all that it seems. As if you're familiar with my book, Life After Breath, having a near-death experience was a double-edged sword to me. And it took a lot of experienced trauma and complexity and difficulty that, I know was really charted in my life, but this experience wasn't about me. I know this experience was my job to give over to you. So it's my hope that we could all see ourselves as spiritual explorers each and every day, trying to find ways to look at life in a new way. So thank you for tuning in. And if you like this video, please feel free to share it with friends or loved ones who may need it. Please also subscribe for great content coming your way. Please also feel free to post your comments in the comment section, as I look through every single comment, and I will try my best to get back to you. And we will also use your comments for future questions and engagement in videos. So thank you all for tuning in, and let's stay in touch and keep the faith and generate the hope. Peace to all.